This is Fortress on a Hill with Henry, Danny, Kagan, and Jovanni.
Welcome to Fortress on a Hill, a podcast about U.S. foreign policy, anti-imperialism, skepticism, and the American way of war. I'm Henry. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. With me is Jovanni. Jovanni, how you doing, man?
I'm doing well. I'm doing well. Thank you for asking. We got a great guest coming up, and yeah, I'm excited.
Yeah, me too. Me too. So we are here today to talk with Monisha Rios about her panel at the Seventh Symposium on Peace and the Abolition of Foreign Military Bases. I think I got the title right there. Monisha, how are you today?
I'm great. I'm excited to be here and really excited to talk about this stuff with y'all. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So Monisha is a Puerto Rican slash Viequense psychologist, social worker, and anti-imperialist veteran of the U.S. Army. For approximately 10 years, has been investigating the American Psychological Association's 104-year role in the weaponization and militarization of psychology in service to imperialism. Monisha works to expose the psychological warfare component of U.S.-led hybrid warfare with a special focus on the narratives used to destabilize people's movements towards liberation from imperial suppression in Latin America and the Caribbean. So, Monisha, bring us into this. Talk to us about this summit, about the location it was at, why that location was chosen, and your kind of overall impressions of it.
Yeah, thank you. So, this was my third time attending this particular conference or seminar, and it's always hosted in Cuba, in Guantanamo, where the illegal base, uh, known as Gitmo in the States, continues to illegally occupy the community and the sovereign nation of Cuba without the consent of the people. And this is hosted, in the past, it's been hosted by a group called Wolf Pass. This time it was hosted by the Cuban Institute for Friendship with the Peoples alongside the World Peace Council. And people from all over the world attend to share information and updates on what is happening in their respective locations with regard to military bases. And it's predominantly US military bases, but other nations that are also occupied by other imperial states, they also discuss. For example, people from Okinawa come to talk about how the Japanese military and the US military are working together um, to occupy their lands. And they're one of the most militarized places on the planet with the highest number of US military bases per square mile than any other place in the world. Um, so yeah, it's the nature of the seminar is to bring people together to help build and strengthen our solidarity with one another, encourage one another, and help inform one another on what's happening, where our struggles are, and how we're moving forward.
And what the presentation that you gave as part of the summit? What tell us about that?
So, people who may not be familiar with Puerto Rico, it's not a single island. It consists of multiple islands. One of those being Vieques. And Culebra is the other one, which is right above Vieques. In 1901, not long after the U.S. invaded and took the islands of Puerto Rico from Spain, they began to militarize Culebra. Later on, in the 1940, 1941 timeframe, they started to militarize Vieques, which consisted of expropriating land, removing population, and creating um, basically a giant bombing range. They took two-thirds of the island of Vieques. One end was for storage of ordnance. There are still bunkers there to this day. The other side was the bombing range, which became sort of the hub for all NATO practice. So the first was Operation Portrix in the 50s, and this was the largest, for the time, the largest all but real war exercise ever to have been done. Um, so they have used Vieques for practice for all of U.S. military operations everywhere, including Iraq, including Vietnam. And that means that every type of warfare that had been developed since 1941 and on had been used in Vieques, again, without the consent of the people. Culebra successfully, the people resisted there and successfully ousted the Navy in 1975, which then added a higher concentration of this to Vieques in the years following that. And this is where my family is from in Puerto Rico. And so my father, my sister, a lot of my relatives lived with the bombings constantly, lived with the multiple types of violence that came from the U.S. military personnel during their off time in the community, which included sexual violence. We still to this day live with contamination. So depleted uranium, Agent Orange, napalm. There's a long, long list of things. 62 years in total, until the People's Resistance uh, stopped that in 2003. 2001, I believe, was when the agreement was made to end, and then 2003 was when everything ended. Uh, so I went to talk about the ongoing struggle for justice for Vieques as well as Culebra. Vieques currently has no hospital, which means that all of the cancer rates and all of the other illnesses associated with the contamination due to the military use, um, people are dying constantly. Children are dying constantly. We're born with birth defects, all these rare types of cancers, and have to rely on a very flawed and intentionally flawed ferry system to get to and from the bigger island of Puerto Rico to access healthcare, because there has never been adequate healthcare on either of these two smaller islands. And then after the hurricanes, there has not been an effort to provide adequate healthcare, to rebuild the hospital, to help increase the quality of life and access to basically what is a human right for these people. And some of that comes from, for my people, I mean, and some of that comes from the punishment for having kicked out the Navy. So in the speech I gave, it was basically to update folks on how we're doing and to remind people that the struggle has not ended. We still deal with open detonation of unexploded ordnance. We're still polluted. We're still sick, and we're still living with the results of this. And we still need solidarity. We still need support. We still need people amplifying the struggle and um, helping us to not only hold the Puerto Rican government and U.S. government accountable and demand a proper response from them to value our lives, but also all the other countries in NATO that made up NATO during the years that we were a rent arrangement. So to also demand that the other countries whose ordinance is still with us also participate in the cleanup and, offer some sort of reparation, contribute to the building of an adequate facility. Um, there have been various legal attempts to get the U.S. to it's called the Vieques Restoration and something else Act, to provide compensation to the people who are continually harmed by this contamination and made sick. So that's why I went, in addition to, you know, sh- giving my solidarity to others who are in similar struggle.
I've been studying the U.S. early occupation in Fallujah recently, and reading about the contamination that they have there, and that one other contaminant that was very high in the reports I saw for Vieques was lead, which is a really horrible problem there. And I thought to myself, in terms of, Fallujah was essentially, as a battle, used as a bombing range almost, or an artillery range, for how much fell onto it, and they're still trying to determine what's what. But in terms of overall quantity of the contaminants, that it was like, I think 5-1 or 6-1 that the average Viqueñez citizen has compared to what's supposed to be normal. Just absolutely unbelievable, and it should have a system set up very. I don't know about how good it works, but that like at Camp Lejeune, that the contamination that has happened there, that families can actually apply for compensation and medical care and all those things, and this exact same thing needs to happen with Vieques too. Giovanni, jump in here, man.
Yeah, I'm here listening and I'm thinking about the contracts between Guantanamo and Vieques. And it's interesting that Vieques that Guantanamo was chose to for this seminar for peace. Guantanamo being the first permanent overseas US base, overseas US base being Guantanamo, which was came as a result of the war with Spain in 1898, where both Puerto Rico and Cuba came under U.S. occupation, being Puerto Rico and Cuba, the last remaining Spanish colonies in the Americas. Uh, and the contrast, because I've been to Guantanamo when I was a teen. When I was a teenager, I did a layover Guantanamo. We were flying from Norfolk, Virginia, into the Dominican Republic, and then we did my dad was in the military. We went on a space safe flight, a space available flight. So we laid over in Guantanamo, and we're there for about an hour or two. Not even an hour, not even an hour, less than an hour, because we didn't really get off the plane either. We just stayed inside the plane. They changed cargo, and then we flew again. Like, so I was a teen, but I'm hearing the contracts between Guantanamo and Vieques, because if you go to Guantanamo, I've never been there as an adult, as a soldier, but a lot of people have been stationed there. It's like a little America there. They have McDonald's, they have everything. They have the bowling alley, they have nightclubs. They have all kinds of stuff. And I was there. I was in Cuba in 2015. I remember some of the delegation I went with, peace delegation I went with. Some of the people there were surprised to learn that Guantanamo is actually a part of Cuba. In their mind, they thought Guantanamo was an island. Was an island outside of Cuba. And most people associate it with being a penal colony because of ever since the so-called war on terror. That's what you have. They've been placing people there without any type of charges, without any type of just having people in prison there for years on in limbo. There's no with no, like I said, no charges of any crimes, no nothing, right? They just been there. So people associate Guantanamo with being a penal colony. But I remember before that, in 2000, was 94, 95. I'm dating myself here. Guantanamo was used as a place to put people migrating out of Haiti and Cuba. Around that time, there was a lot of migration coming out in rafts, trying to get to Florida and whatnot. So they were the Coast Guard was picking up Haitian migrants and were rerouting them into this house in Guantanamo. They were there for a long time, and I was stationed with people that were there. A couple of facts about Guantanamo is that it became a permanent U.S. base in 1903, and for several reasons. Because one, it was a fueling a coal place. That's what it started out, a coal fueling place for U.S. steamships, naval steamships. Same as Vieques, because Vieques, people think about Vieques, but it was Vieques, and it's also a part. Vieques is an island, but it's also a part of coastal Puerto Rico, where the actual main base was at, and it was in Ceiba. That's where the actual headquarters and the main base was in Ceiba. So it was a big gunnery range and everything. But between Vieques, Ceiba, Culebra, and Guantanamo, the U.S. patrolled the Caribbean, from rivals from Europe, mainly Germany, etc. Right, and also during the same time, 1902, that's when the construction for Panama Canal started. So it was a way also to defend the Panama Canal from those European rivals. It was a way to project, and Guantanamo was a way to project power in the Caribbean. But what a lot of people don't understand is, right, they have a permanent lease association with Cuba, meaning that they went into this lease with the colonial government that was installed after the Spanish-American War in Cuba. But after and it was all groovy. But after the revolution in 1959, the Cuban government, wanted the U.S. government to leave, wanted the autonomy or the sovereignty back from the U.S. and wanted the Americans to leave. And because of the permanent lease uh, treaty or agreement they had with the previous governments, the United States have been left. So the U.S. pay the Cuban government about $4,000 a month. What's interesting about this is uh, that ever since 1959, the Cuban government has not cashed any single check of of those $4,000 that they get paid for the leasing the territory, the land there. And the reason why is because they don't want to legitimize the U.S. presence there by cashing those checks. You know, but are you able to show a picture of what Guantanamo looks like, Henry?
Oh yeah, give me just a second. I got right.
So, so Manisha, I wanted you to ask you about that. And before we were talking, before we started the show, I was telling her that my first duty station was in Indianapolis for Benjamin Harrison. We had a Cuban doctor there. And he was counter-revolutionary, of course, and he left Cuba, shortly after or before the revolution. But he used to tell me stories about Guantanamo because as a young doctor, he used to work there. He used to work in Guantanamo area, and he used to work in the brothels. He used to work in the brothels where soldiers would frequent. And he used to tell me that he was proud of it too. He used to tell me uh, that if a particular brothel, soldiers started coming out sick, from STD, call up on him, to have checkups on the women and make sure the women were STD free and everything because they didn't want to get blacklisted. And that was so something proud of that, something that he was proud about telling me about that for some reason. But I just wanted to get from you being that you were in these two places in Guantanamo around the surrounding area. Of course, you wasn't in a base, I don't think, but also seeing how the contrast with Vieques and Ceiba and Fajardo and how that is, compare the two.
Yeah, there's so much in common. Um, and we got to go to the hotel where they had been able to zoom in and actually get the photos, those original photos that expose the treatment of the detainees at Guantanamo. This was before they moved the detainees. So we could actually see the guard towers and we could see a little bit inside from that position. But being in the surrounding community and seeing and listening to people who have lived there their whole lives, and the generations that have lived there and hearing the stories, it's so similar to what our own people have gone through because it's basically the same thing. You could you always have sexual violence with U.S. military presence. There's no getting around that fact. And in addition to the other types of violence, and so you have still remnants of that. You have the traumatic, like the lingering pain and suffering, from people who experienced being raped and experienced being sold and trafficked basically to satisfy the military rape culture. And so, yeah, it's we're one and the same when it comes to that. And then the same mentality that allowed it to happen in the first place exists in Puerto Rico and exists in Cuba. And it's really disappointing, but not surprising that there are people who are willing to sell their own people off like that. Um, and be proud of it. That exists over here too. And there's people here in Vieques that are still so rageful that the Navy was kicked out. And they use that as punishment. They use that as a retort for when we protest and demand better services. We demand basically that our human rights be respected, and that we have access to healthcare and maritime transportation. Well, you shouldn't have kicked out the Navy. Life was so much better with the Navy. You had an economy with the Navy. You had a hospital with the Navy, and you had all this with the Navy, but nobody thinks about what else we had with the Navy. And it's the same story that they use to justify the presence in Guantanamo. Oh, but they would have it so much better if they weren't against the Navy. But that's not really true.
I saw that that of a population of 8,000, 8,500, right in there for Vieques, that there's only 30 people that have been hired to work on the cleanup efforts through the EPA and DoD. And I'm like, 30 out of 8,000. Yeah, you guys are doing nothing for them, aren't you? I mean, um, but no, it's, if we're able to throw around a few jobs, people are wanted, but they don't see that. They don't see the blowback that comes from even the smallest US military base. And of course, depending on the country that it's in and the people that you send there, but it always there's always cast off. There's always it's like the lead flying through the air from the wind and contaminating other areas. It can't stay where it is.
And our population has dwindled dramatically. It's escalated after the hurricanes, but slowly, over time, because of the intentional neglect and lack of investment in infrastructure and in human services, um, it's gone way, 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 way down. We used to have a lot more people there, but people leave. Uh, and it's also, I think, important for people listening to think about, if they have any doubt over any type of economic benefit that may come from the US military presence and jobs and all of that stuff. What kind of jobs? What kind of jobs? My father worked on the base. He was a shoe shine boy. He was a bartender. He worked in the kitchen, you know? And then the rest of it is just to satisfy the needs of the people who are lifted up and placed in a superior position over you in your own country.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's like
like that status. You see that a lot. um, like that status within the military. You do an equivalent. I see this a lot where had you you do an equivalent and a civilian equivalent job in the military, but the fact that you're wearing a uniform doing the same thing that someone else is doing outside, just put you in a higher echelon and helps you feel, gives this air of superiority, and people would put you on pedestal because of the fact you're using you're using the uniform, whereas the same job that you're doing that someone is doing as civilian, right? They don't get the same the same treatment. They don't get the same appreciation. Same, they're not putting the same pedestal.
and for people listening that maybe didn't serve, that I know the three of us as veterans understand the really chintzy, nasty stuff that soldiers get made to do in terms of cleaning and details and mowing lawns on posts and all those different kind of things. But like you said, is it for some reason that if we got that uniform on, we got that little thing on our collar. Hey, I work for Uncle Sam. It doesn't matter that I just mow lawns, or it doesn't matter that I'm just a cook because I've got this other thing. But that and those mindsets get set into everybody, including people in the places where we end up making bases, like Monisha, what you were just talking about. So I'm looking through my notes here, seeing if there's any other stuff we want to talk about.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you, Monisha. Going back to that seminar, what other delegation was represented there, and and if those other delegations that were there, did they also have the same message? Do they also have came from places that also had military bases in their countries?
Yeah, yeah. So there obviously because of COVID, the numbers were lower of in-person attendance this time. There were people from Palestine, Philippines, Venezuela, Nicaragua, and I'm trying to think off the top of my head. I can look it up too real quick. Um, and for people who couldn't send a representative from their nation or group, There were people like, for example, one of the representatives from Code Pink, and also Veterans for Peace and Right, um, she spoke about the occupation in the Pacific beyond what the representative from the Philippines. There was a person from Greece. There was a person from obviously there were folks there from Cuba who discussed the details of the impact of the illegal base there. Um, and I think what I'm sorry, I just want to make sure that I'm fully answering your question. Did you also ask me what I got out of?
No, and yeah, what you got out of it? I was wondering, what was their message? Their message, what areas? What was it? Was their experience? What what they were describing, was it similar to um what you experience, or what people in Vieques experience, or the narrative that you've collected in Vieques from people there. Was their narrative similar? Was there similarity? Was there symmetry with theirs? And this is very important, because this is how you develop, by having these seminars, by having, Q's been good at, having these people's seminars, these people's summits and whatnot. We used to get people, unheard people that mostly are not heard of, that you don't see on CNN or MSNBC, or you see those voices, and come together, and these settings, and people share stories, um people share, experiences with each other. And that's how you build this connectivity, this global kinship, amongst people, um, that the elite media or legacy media, casting a shadow or make it as relevant. I just wanted to get from you, the stories that you heard, were they, how similar were it to the stories that you've collected in Vieques?
Yeah, and I just want to correct myself too. I went back and looked at the list of countries represented in person, and Nicaragua wasn't there, but we did try to make sure that the Nicaraguan people were not forgotten. Um, so Hawaii was also discussed, Colombia, Argentina, Brazil, Barbados, Mexico, Italy, the Philippines, Spain, and Greece. And so I think where a lot of focus was this time, particularly given the current state we're in with the climate crisis, is the pollution. So that was a common thread throughout a lot of the presentations, was especially with Hawaii, was about that, about, with the escalation of climate change at the rate that it's going, alongside the escalation of imperial aggression, uh, we're only advancing the climate crisis. And so I think that's where a lot of the emphasis was. And this is very, very felt here in Vieques as well, and Culebra and the rest of Puerto Rico and the rest of the Caribbean, because of, you know, with the increase in storms, with the increase in extreme weather, um, all of the all of this weaponry, all of the way that they try to supposedly contain the things that they use to take life in such a brutal manner, the bio warfare, the chemical warfare, and so on, all of that is at risk of being, you know, uh, by weather. And so that's a huge concern for people, is not only is the imperial aggression, which we're used to, the ongoing problem, but now the increased risks of harm to innocent people, who do not have a say in whether or not the US or any other, similarly minded nation state it imposes its will on them and imposes its weaponry on them in such a way as to endanger their lives forever for generations to come. So that, I think, was the biggest um emotion, worry for people this time around, was that. because it creates an entirely new set of problems that we have to figure out how to survive while also trying to fight against imperial violence.
The guys and I love doing the podcast. Being able to share our experiences in the military with allies and supporters means the world to us. But we can't do all the work. We need you to share an episode of ours with somebody, anyone, who you think might be affected by it. Young people looking to join the military or parents advocating for one, conscientious citizens who care about the violence the U.S. wages in their name, advocates for women and people of color who understand the harsh environment the military creates for minorities and inflicts on minorities across the globe. Yeah, please share those with them. We get asked often what people can do to help support the podcast. One very powerful way is to help us grow and reach more people is to leave us a review. You can do that on iTunes, which is the best place to leave a review. iTunes does reach the most people these days. The next best place is Facebook. Go to our Fortress on a Hill Facebook page and look for the reviews tab. And finally, there's Patreon, where we're blessed to have an array of wonderful supporters helping us for some of the podcast's expenses. Those who contribute $10 or more a month will be mentioned here as an honorary producer, helping keep you, our listeners, stocked with new episodes. But you don't have to contribute $10 a month to help us. For as little as $1 a month, you can help us keep going, paying for hosting and storage fees, transcribing old and new episodes, promoting and expanding the podcast, and more I'm sure I can't think of at the moment. So let's bring out these honorary producers, and they are Fahim Shirazi, James O'Barr, Adam Bellows, Eric Phillips, Paul Appel, Julie Dupree, Thomas Benson, Janet Hansen, Tristan Oliver, Daniel Fleming, Michael Caron, Zach H., Ren Jacob, Howard Reynolds. Why I Am Anti-War Podcast, Korgoth, Rick Coffee, and the Status Quo Podcast. You are all the engine that helps us power the podcast. Thank you so much. However, if Patreon isn't your style, you can contribute directly to us through PayPal at paypal.me/fortressonahill. Or please check out our store on Spreadshirt for some great Fortress merch. There's t-shirts, mugs, phone cases, and a whole lot more. And now let's get back to the podcast. We're on Twitter at Fortress on a Hill and also Facebook.com at Fortress on a Hill. You can find our main blog page and our full collection of episodes at www.fortressonahill.com. iTunes, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, Patreon, Spotify, you name it. Anywhere you listen, we're waiting for you. And hey, we're always in the market for more Patreon supporters. Please consider becoming a member at patreon.com. If you're not into doing a monthly payment, think about giving us a couple bucks on PayPal. The link is in the show notes. Skepticism is one's best armor. Never forget it. We'll see you next time.
I wanted to read something from the Platt Amendment, which the Platt Amendment was something inserted into the Cuban Constitution right after the war with Spain, the U.S., Cuban, and Spanish War. Because I say U.S., Cuban, and Spanish War because the Cuban locals were fighting the Spanish before the U.S. intervened. They were fighting the Spanish for several years, and they were actually on the verge of defeating the Spanish because the Spanish Empire was crumbling at the time. They had instability back home. They had a series of civil wars back home and political instability. Plus, they had at the time they had an uprising in the Philippines as well. They were fighting insurgency in the Philippines. They were fighting insurgency in Cuba, and they were fighting, and so they were, they just lost most of the colonies. So they were an empire that was in its last throes. That was just in life support. So they were on the verge of being defeated in Cuba when the U.S. entered in 1898. After the explosion of the Maid, which was the trigger. Remember the Maid? That was the trigger to get the U.S. Involved into the war. And then the war only lasted about 3 months, and then the Spanish were defeated, and the Paris Treaty, they signed off Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, the Mariana Islands, and the Philippines, to sign it off to the U.S. And Hawaii, you mentioned Hawaii was, was also included in the package, for good measure. Hawaii wasn't a Spanish colony, but it was a coal fueling place for U.S. Navy going to trade with China. So during the same time in 1898, that's when they overthrew the Hawaiian Queen, and then that's when Hawaii also became a territory of the United States. But in the Plan Amendment, which was a constitution that was written for independent Cuba, which is nominal independent, the Plan Amendment was inserted, and it was a part of the Plan Amendment that justified Guantanamo is that, and I'm gonna read a part of it right here if I can get it open. That to enable the United States to maintain the independence of Cuba and to protect the people thereof, as well as for its defense, the government of Cuba will sell or lease to the United States lands necessary for coaling or naval stations at certain specific points to be agreed upon with the President of the United States. That was inserted into the Plan Amendment, which was part of that was inserted into the Cuban Constitution. Therefore, in their Constitution, it gave permission to the United States the right to have soldiers there, occupy land there. And this was and only the United States has the right to leave if it wants to. Not the Cuban government, and no one. Only the United States has the right to leave if it wants to. But this was turned over its head with the Cuban Revolution, because the Cuban Revolution tore up that constitution and they rewrote a new constitution, the Revolutionary Constitution. So I just want to put out there, because you mentioned Hawaii, and I just want to put that little bit of history, because people tend to make all the connections, with these type of things. Why do you have bases in Guantanamo? There's this false idea that we're there for the benefit of the people there. So I was watching the fight. I'm a huge boxing fan. I was watching the fight the other day, and the way they announced the main fight. This is to all the millions of people and all the service members watching us and around the world. That's the announcer. So it's a pride, that you have service members around the world, but no one really stops and asks themselves why you have so many people around the world. I forgot where I was going with this comment, but yeah, what is your reflection on that? Cuba obviously played a huge impact in the 20th century. They became, fully independent in 1959 with the overthrow, not only the overthrow of the government of Batista, but also they overthrew the sugarcane company, the American sugarcane companies that were operating in Cuba, many dominoes and all that, right? They also overthrew the mafia that was operating Havana, that had Havana control. So they overthrew all of that, and they rid themselves off of U.S. colonial control, and they became independent nation. They've been paying for it ever since. You're just like in Vieques, they've been sanctioned ever since. Ever since that period. But they played a huge role, despite the fact they played a huge role in the 20th century, and they support a lot of national liberation movements around the world. They supported South Africa. They defeated the South African military twice in the 1980s. They supported the newly independent country of Angola from Portuguese colonialism, and then they supported Grenada, when they became free from the UK, which sparked the war against Grenada in '83. What do you think is their role today in the 21st century? Obviously, they don't have, we're not supposedly in the Cold War. They don't have that revolutionary rhetoric or, and that imposing presence that they had back in the 20th century. What do you think is their role today?
I think I can only speak for myself and what I draw from the times I've been able to go and learn and listen to people and really counter the U.S. Cold War narratives that are continually perpetuated today within my own mind, by listening and seeing it for myself and asking tough questions while I'm there. And so what really gives me a lot of hope and inspiration in the 21st century is that Cuba continues to be in revolution. They're really demonstrating how it's a process and that the outcome is ongoing. For example, just everything that you listed, there were some very abrupt pieces of the process that had to take place in order to create the space for the rest of the process to continue and to be able to continue in that while being sanctioned, while having the murderous economic warfare that's going on, while having the psychological warfare that's going on, but then to continue to um, do like a cultural revolution. Like right now, the changes to the family code that are going on, the way that in recent years there was an effort to change the Constitution yet again and evolve by learning from the missteps and from a lot of people will, including myself earlier on before I made an effort to learn more, um the homophobia and a lot of the cultural things that are present in all of the places that were colonized by the Spanish. That's present in all of our cultures. It's present here in Puerto Rico. It's present in the United States. All of these things, especially for the context of the time in which the revolution began, these were commonalities among a lot of cultures, but the narrative will have people believe that this is the revolution creating homophobia. Um, and the way that in that particular thing, including also gender violence against women and having the revolution within the revolution, and the way that now, even in Cuban culture, which again comes from Spanish colonial culture with African culture and Taino culture mixed in, there are people who are resistant to change and evolution, and they may be counter-revolutionary, or they may not necessarily align fully with, you know, um, the Cuban government. But there is democracy happening, and it's happening literally from the bottom up. And so that these changes are happening slowly, but they're happening. And what they're doing, for example, when I was there and I was watching some of the TV, they have educational programs on the various gender identities and on why it's important for people to understand what this means and that we're not supposed to be criminalizing this. We're not supposed to be having family violence. So there's an effort to make these changes from the ground up. So then that's reflected in policy. And that's how they were able to advance these changes in the family code from the ground up through educational campaigns. Um, and I think that what that exemplifies for me is how necessary it is to simultaneously be firm in your resistance to imperialism and basically colonization and protect um, the advances that have been made over time, um, and be flexible enough to listen to the needs of the people and to grow and to recognize where there have been um, poorly informed choices or where the culture itself has been at fault for causing harm. Um, so I think that that's really fantastic um, for people in other places who are also for example, here in Puerto Rico, where we're still struggling to be free, um, that but we have the same problems. We have the crisis of we actually have more problems here with femicide, more problems here with violence, with gender-based violence and homophobia and transphobia than what people can see in Cuba. And that's not to say that it doesn't exist, but what we don't have here is the ability in control over our own country in such a way that we can advance these changes culturally that we need to see so that human rights can be respected. So what I see from the Cuban Revolution now in the 21st century is a real strong example of how the evolutionary process of revolution can take place culturally underneath all of the other pressures that they have going on. I hope that answered your question.
I wanted to go back to something we talked about it here in bits and pieces, but I'd like to take a moment and really dig into it. Um, that let's, I guess, for lack of a better way to say it, the psychological contamination that comes from living in proximity to a military base, a bombing range, an Air Force range, noise pollution, light pollution. The place that really sticks in my mind right now is Okinawa, with where the air base is situated, and how that flies over schools and all kinds of other things. Um, you seem like someone who would be really apt to dissect that, to talk about that more. Please talk us through uh, your impressions of the psychological effects of living near military bases, and also what you talked about earlier about sexual trauma, sexual assault as well.
Yeah. So basically, a lot of what we go through as veterans with PTS uh, is what the communities go through. Um, and so, for example, my dad would tell me stories of how, it would feel being woken up by the sound of the bombings, and that sometimes like the stray bullets would come into the houses and things like that. And a lot of the elders in the community, and we don't have to go back that far really, because it just stopped in 2003.
Sure,
To,
sure.
to hear, the way that people experience that. But then what lingers now is exactly the same symptoms that a lot of us have, you know. And there's still gun violence and stuff from drug trafficking that occurs here. Um, there's massacres, and there's people dying constantly, which is also a product of US interventionism. But it's there's a lot of hypervigilance. There's a lot of like hyperreactivity to sound. There's a lot of I hate the phrase mental illness, but I'll say dis-ease in a way that people cannot feel at ease. They've lost peace of mind. So there's hypertension, because the physical and the mental and the emotional, they're all connected and related. Um, so it's terrifying. A lot of people and I'm thinking of some of my own family members, um, are easily startled, you know, and just yeah, the PTS that we experience is also being experienced in community, and then you also have the effects of the sexual violence, and that's not as discussed um, as openly. Um, there's a lot of victim blaming and shaming still that takes place. There's a lot of it's just a lack of compassion, understanding, and empathy. But that again comes from the machismo and all that in our culture. But it also comes from, I mean, that's general too across cultures when it comes to sexual violence. But yeah, I would say that the psychological impacts too of the environmental contamination of being under occupation. Um, I would relate that a lot to what you might hear people from Palestine express about, their stress, their emotions, their anger, their rage, their fear, um, and depression. We have a lot of suicides, the hopelessness that comes from it, you know, like and apathy, a lot of apathy, a lot of fatalism, that feeling of nothing's gonna change, so why bother? This is just how it is.
Um, uh,
I listen among the youth as well.
Mhm.
I was gonna say, for any teenager or newly married couple or whatever, the idea that you're going to provide your kids or nieces and nephews with any kind of peace of mind, any kind of healthy life, um, yeah, that must be horrifying. I I I go back to what I said earlier about Fallujah, that we have this idea, Americans and somewhat among the anti-war movement, that if you want to go and find what the military has really done, you have to go to Afghanistan. You have to go to Iraq. You have to go to Syria. It's not that far away. It's right here. It's right next door. It's at the southern border. It's in Cuba. It's in Puerto Rico. We convince ourselves that um, the idea of war and our separation from it is much bigger than it is. And people need to be willing to understand that. But I hear what you're saying in terms of, like, American culture. We still have very little empathy for sexual assault survivors. We don't want to connect it to the hypermasculinity of our culture in any meaningful way, or we're happy to blame it on other cultures, depending on what the situation is. But um, just to have all of that, it's a horrifying, horrifying thing. I'm out of words to say about it.
I would add too that people can inside they can just even look at the original peoples that are in the concentration camps called reservations and see the same thing. But what that does is then that makes people who identify as U.S. citizens have to reflect on colonialism and their own role in that. Even if we weren't the ones who initiated the process, the process is ongoing, and it has created the space that we call home, and it's there in front of our faces, and there are still people being harmed by it. So then it's like creates like almost an identity crisis, but also like a crisis in a person's conscience about um, just like our moral injury that we experience once we become conscious and we actually allow ourselves to look at what it was we were involved in, what it was we were even unwittingly, but still at times consensually participating in, thinking we were doing the right thing. Yeah.
That's one thing that people, I hope that as time goes on, it becomes easier. But when I explain to someone that as a veteran, they were a cog in a machine, and that they did not or could not fully comprehend exactly what machine they were supporting, couldn't go back to it and say, I knew that I was connected to this and connected to that. And I know for me that I am always on a journey of um, redoing my history, redoing the history that has been taught to me, to go back to things that have been that as Americans we don't look too closely at because it gets too ugly. And people they don't have to accept personal responsibility for what their ancestors did, but they have to understand how the system was perpetuated and how it still exists today. And that things are not as simple as we're going to end racism. That the civil rights movement did not end racism. It certainly changed a lot of people's lives. But again, the project is ongoing. All of them are ongoing, and all of them with these different systems. And um, I joked with the guest a while ago that there are times when I'm reading about a topic and I read about something that I have no idea about, and I have to take an amount of time, hours or days, to learn enough of that to go back and continue to understand the context of what I was going through. And that's the process that everybody has to do. Anybody who wants to understand how foreign policy really affects our lives, they have to be willing to go through that and to be honest about how it makes them feel, to understand, about what that goes through. It's like, this is really messed up and shameful. It's like, yeah, let's do something about it. That don't let shame or upset be the last thing that you do. Don't let watching that one documentary or whatever it is be the last step you take in trying to de-imperialize yourself, if we want to if we want to call it that. Well, Giovanni, you want to jump in, man?
Yeah, I mean, it's very, good, good points both of you guys made. Um, how do we decolonialize our mind? How do we de-imperialize ourselves? And it's funny because, um, you know, in the military, Puerto Ricans have a high representation in the military. Amongst the highest, representation per capita. I mean, there's the population of Puerto Ricans about, I think, about 3.5 million people, but per capita has, one of the highest. I think Armenians and Native Americans, right, or Native people, surpass Puerto Ricans in representation in the military, right? And you gotta ask yourself why, right? There's three cultures, there's three people, right? Native American, Guamanian, people from Guam, Guamanians, and Puerto Ricans. Why they have such a high presence in the United States military. What's being offered. What's out there. What's the lingering. What's the story behind it? It's not just that. Uh, these people, they just, were created from nothing to join the military. There's something behind it. And I challenge people to look, what's behind it. What's happening in those communities that's driving people to join the military, in such high numbers. Um, it's funny because I train a lot of soldiers. I've trained soldiers, and I make comparisons between the Puerto Rican soldiers that I've come across, as a trainer, as a military trainer, when I train soldiers and whatnot. I compare with the Puerto Ricans that grew up here in the United States and the Puerto Ricans that came from Puerto Rico. A lot of the Puerto Ricans most of the Puerto Ricans that grew up in the United States, born and raised in the United States, right? Most of them are completed high school, they joined the military right after high school, etc., or whatnot. But a lot of these Puerto Ricans that come from Puerto Rico, right? Many of them, they have degrees. They have degrees. They have 4-year colleges, degrees and whatnot. And you ask yourself why, why you have a degree and everything, why you joined the military. So you got to ask yourself why, Puerto Rico's been a position, a colony in the United States for 100, I think 20 years now. What's the what has that shown? What in the ground? How is that shown in the ground? You've been a part of the United States, independent United States for 120 years, right? What have you given to offer other than the military? So those type of questions that I often ask myself. Um, any last thoughts on that, Manisha? If not, tell us where we can find your work and what are you doing next and whatnot.
Yeah. No, you really pinpointed something. I think that people who are listening, I invite them to think more deeply about, what is it about being colonized that drives that create, what are the conditions of colonialism that make it easy to recruit us, you know? And then how do those conditions of us as colonized people relate to the conditions of the poor people in the United States that also make them easy to recruit? From all of the different racialized hierarchies and gender hierarchies and all of that stuff. But yeah, even as colonized people, which I mean basically we all are, um, we've got to, I feel like, work harder to undo that training that we've been given and wrestle with the emotions of that go with that, as we become more conscious, poco a poco, little by little, when the consciousness comes and then we have the emotions that go with it. And I really like, Henry, what you said, that, we can't let shame be the last thing. We can't let, just watching a documentary be the thing. We have got to do tangible work to undo these systems and abolish the very things that are creating these conditions. Um, and I feel like a lot of people do get stuck at the shame part. Um, and of course, that's also, I feel, in part by design, because when you look at the poor quality, truly, of mental health services that are available to people, you know, there's not a whole lot of room for us to move beyond shame in a healthy way, not in an individualistic, self-centered, well, I'm going to let myself off the hook so I don't have to feel bad way, but in a way that actually equips us to create real, actual change to these systems and abolish these systems um, that created the problem to begin with. But anyway, I'm going to get off that tangent because I'll just go on and on. Um, what I'm working on now, being here in the homeland in Puerto Rico, I actually um, had to leave Vieques for my own health reasons to help me recover from COVID, to go and access healthcare and support my recovery. But then also I kind of got deployed over here to set up a medical solidarity support area for people who are coming from Vieques and Culebra to access healthcare. So I used my veterans benefits to get a house in Ceiba, which is right near the ferry port. Um, it's so that as well as a minivan, so that I can pick people up from the port and they can come stay here for free. Um, for as long as they need to access appointments. If they have to come here to care for loved ones, or if have to have a surgery and need some recovery time before getting back on the boat. You name it, if they get abandoned by the ferry. So the project is slowly being built now. The need has been so great that I've already needed to receive people. One person was sleeping in their car while their parent was in critical condition. Um, like I'll do food deliveries for people. It's whatever the need is. I've been doing it all through my disability check each month. Um,
Oh,
got a fundraiser going because there needs to be some renovations to make it, wheelchair accessible, get furniture, redo the kitchen, get a water heater, get all the things in place for it to be a healthy, like sanitary place. And then from there, build out more programming. And eventually for myself to move on. I'm living in the house right now while it's being fixed up, but ideally the goal is to build up enough uh I guess material support to where the house gets paid off and is no longer in my name, but instead belongs to the community, and is used strictly for medical solidarity for Vieques and Culebra. And then I'll move the other aspects of the project to a different location, including myself. So that's what I'm doing.
that sounds incredible. I'm uplifted to hear this what you're working on, and it's um and that is the things that we have to do, that we can't collectivize all our problems and only put the solution only on the individuals. That if these are the things that people have to carry, we have to help them unburden themselves through the community in the same way. So I applaud you. That's just amazing. Um, so thank you so much for taking the time to come and talk with us. Um, Monisha Rios.
Misha, can you? Yeah, I was going to say that. Can you share you know, can you share your fundraiser? Um, your fundraising also. If are you already on any social media, people can follow your work, what you do.
Yeah, thanks. So I just right now that I have a bit.ly link for the fundraiser. I'm using DonorBox for it. But the project is called Centro Solidario. In English, that's Solidarity Center. But so it's bit.ly/CEN as in Nancy, T as in Tom, ROS as in Sam, P as in Paul, R, Centro SPR. So that's where folks can see the current fundraiser. And I do have some social media stuff, but to be honest with you, I don't have the capacity to run it all well. So I do try to update on Twitter, which is at Centro_SPR, I believe. I'm also on Facebook with the project, and I have an Instagram that I don't use because I don't know how to use Instagram. But um, yeah, hopefully, when I get more volunteers and a bigger team, I'll be able to do more on social media.
Sounds great. All right. Well, thank you, Monisha, for your time, and hope to talk to you again soon. Maybe we can get in a while. We can get an update on the project and see how things are going along.
Thank you again for having me and spotlighting Vieques.
Yeah,
Of
thank you
course.
for the work you're doing. And, keep at it. Keep doing
Hell yeah.
what you're
Hell
doing.
yeah.
You're an inspiration.
We're on Twitter at Fortress on a Hill, and also at Facebook.com at Fortress on a Hill. You can find our main blog page and our full collection of episodes at www.fortressonahill.com. iTunes, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, Patreon, Spotify. You name it, almost anywhere you listen, we're already waiting for you. And hey, we're always in the market for more Patreon supporters. Please consider becoming a patron at patreon.com. And if you're not into giving us a monthly payment, think about giving us a couple bucks on PayPal. The link is in the show notes. Skepticism is one's best armor. Never forget it. We'll see you next time.